Hi, everybody. Welcome to the CoronaSphere Lounge. Excuse me while I make a small adjustment. Sorry about the delay today. It's been one of those days. Yep, there we go. There's only so much about the Batcave that I'm willing to reveal. I hope everybody's doing well. We've got a little bit of a late start tonight. Been Just couldn't catch up on the schedule. It just was just getting too far away from me. So I thought we would just have to delay it rather than cancel it. Anyway, here we are. Um, I have some interesting news tonight, and there it's not particularly fun this time. This is interesting, and so I'd like to set this up. I think before I really get too far into it. Let me see here. Okay, so as you know, if you're a regular viewer of the Stratosphere Lounge and the rest of the work I do, I spend a fair amount of time talking about um, conspiracy theories, specifically my disbelief in virtually all of them, and the ease at which it's often one's often able to just basically destroy these theories, often by granting them the case. Uh, and so that led me to a thought before I get into the topic tonight, and that thought is, how does a person figure out what's true? Uh, and I have to say that this, when I get right down to it, is a huge part of the job I've been doing for not just for the last 10 or 15 years with the commentary, but pretty much throughout my whole life. How do you tell what's true? There are um, so many different opinions out there, and there are so many, and the internet multiplies this by orders and orders and orders of magnitude. Uh, and so you're confronted with any number of theories, and how do you tell what's true? Um, when I was in debate in high school, I really got a good sense of this. I was Our topic was prison reform that particular year, and if you know anything about how debate in I'm an NFL player. I didn't know if I mentioned that before, but I spent a couple years in the NFL, uh, National Forensic League, the debate squad. But basically, what it comes down to is in structured debate, which is there to teach you how to argue, really. There's a topic, which means that you're not limited to the entire universe of potential ideas. But there's a topic assigned by the National Forensic League in any given year. And then anything that's within that topic is fair game. Um, so in our case, when the topic was prison reform, 1977. I'm sure they've changed it. They do change it every year. I'm sure they cycle around. Anything that had anything to do with prison reform was a legitimate topic for the debate. And in the way debate is structured is there's an affirmative team and a negative team. The affirmative team will have a case. They will basically have uh, uh, a case. Their job is to present a case. The job of the negative team is to convince the judges that the case isn't true. So, in the case of prison reform, you might say that one topic might be that you want to abolish capital punishment because there's no evidence that capital punishment deters crime. And so you would then put together your case, and you would show all of this evidence of the number of people who are being executed in the course of a year, and you show all the evidence that said that capital punishment has no effect on deterring crime or whatever the case may be. Now, if it turned out that you were negative, you had to be prepared to deal with just about everything. And so you had to do an awful lot of research. And that meant that you had to have buckets of evidence that showed that no, the capital punishment does in fact deter crime and not just deter it from the person who's being executed. And so you'd have to get boatloads of evidence about that. But you never knew really which case you were going to have. And this is when I discovered probably the most important thing that I've learned in my entire life. I learned in debate class. And that is that given any particular topic, especially a specific topic, does capital punishment deter crime, yes or no? We would end up with, in that particular case, I think it must have been 100 evidence cards, little pieces of information that we would have to go to a library and copy things on and paste them on there. But we'd have 100 evidence cards from various studies done around the world and various experts that would show that capital punishment does in fact deter crime. And then right next to it, we'd have another 100 evidence cards that showed that no, capital punishment doesn't deter crime at all. And I will never forget this as long as I live. No matter what the particular subject was, I could come up with scores, dozens, usually hundreds of studies, cases, experts, all of this, who stated in extremely convincing manner that this was true. Whatever the subject was, this is true. And then, because I had to be prepared for it, my partner Willie Gomez and I had to be prepared for it, I'd find another 100 pieces of evidence that said, no, that's not true at all. And that has never left me. Now, unlike some people, excuse me, Alfred not being handy, I just had to grab this. Unlike some people, this did not lead me to think that there's no such thing as truth. On the contrary, I believe more strongly every day that there's such things as truth. I just lost the election. I don't know how, but I'm sure I did. And so the question is, how do you know? How do you know? And that is what high school debate taught me more than anything, was how to look at a case. A case could be the moon landing was fake. 9/11 was an inside job. The Loch Ness Monster is a plesiosaur that lives in a lake in Scotland. Whatever the case may be, years and years of doing this taught me how to analyze and look at data and look at evidence, and it also taught me how to construct cases. And when you do this kind of for a living, lawyers are extremely good at this, I would imagine, you begin to get sort of a natural feel for it. So I'm about to show you something, and we'll talk about this for the rest of the night. But just as a final example, I have, when I was in the planetarium days, when I was 16, 17, people who I knew and trusted, who were fellow astronomers, had told me that they were seeing UFOs out in the Florida Everglades. The fact that Close Encounters of the Third Kind had just come out, and one of my all-time favorite movies. Probably didn't have anything to do with this at all, but nevertheless, they assured me, and these guys weren't just regular people; these were, astronomers young amateur astronomers that I'd hung out with. And so we went out to the Everglades looking for these things, and as usual, we didn't see anything. I was sure I was not going to see anything. And just as it was starting to get dawn, all of a sudden one of them starts screaming and pointing and indicating something up in the sky. And I look at where he's pointing, and I said, "What?" He says, "Don't you see it? Don't you see it?" I said, "Tony, that's a satellite." No, watch, it's moving. I know no, it's changing course. It's not. It's not. Your eye, if you stare at something long enough, you'll start to see it move around, especially like a point of light, because the little muscles in your eye, start to drift. It's called autokinesis. But he was convinced it was, but it wasn't. It was clearly a satellite. There's no question about it. I've seen people see the bottom of flocks of geese as white ovals, and I was convinced they were flying saucers too until I could see the wings and the neck, and then I realized they're not. And several years ago, many years ago, when I was working as an editor, there was a guy there who was like a nationally recognized expert on UFOs, and people said, "Let's have a big debate between you and Bill." So I went over to his house, and he trotted out the best evidence he had. And I would look at the best evidence he had, and the time it took me to destroy the best evidence he had really shocked me how simple that was. Really shocked me. So that's a picture of this turned upside down and inverted. Yeah, well, what about this? Well, if that was actually what you say it was, then the line would have to be 500 miles long. Just look at the scale based on. Yeah, okay, well, what about this? Back and forth. So all of this to say what I'm going to talk about next is obviously pretty controversial, and I want you to know that I make a, a living out of trying to figure out what's true and not true, not because there is evidence for it against it, but by being able to weigh the evidence for and against it. Now, with that said, um, I want to show you something here. This is the topic of the show today, and I'm going to put it in real quick so that I can just grab another image, and then we'll talk about it. Sorry, it wants to play funny with me, so why don't we just do it this way then? Um, I have, in the course of the last year or so, I got a chance to work with some people at a company called Epoch Times. They're a Chinese-based organization, it's a newspaper. They're based on they're Chinese patriots, basically, who are dead set against the Communist Party. And I had a chance to do a number of interviews with them, and I thought they were pretty good guys. And so I did a number of on-camera interviews with them. And imagine my surprise when I saw a link to this. Whoops. I'll just resize it here. This is the picture of it on YouTube. It's a video called "The Origin of the Wuhan Virus," and it's Joshua Phillips is the guy's name. Um, I saw this documentary. I didn't know it was Joshua in it. Somebody recommended that you should see this. I was looking at another set of podcasts that were saying that they were seeing a disturbing number of people who had recovered from COVID-19 seem to be reinfecting. That somehow the virus would be activated. And and though that's and so somebody said take a look at this documentary, and I thought this is going to be another one of those documentaries that I've seen where it's like, okay, um, you know, a lot of like the 9/11 documentaries, the moon landing documentaries. They're going to make an entire point out of something like a shadow or a this or a glint on the bottom of a one still frame. I've seen it so many times, but this um, documentary I watched. It's about 50 minutes long, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called Tracking Down the Origin of the Wuhan Virus. It's got about 250,000 views now. It'll have way more than that in the next day or two. Um, so my professional opinion on cases, I'm not a virologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I am a guy who's spent a lot of time trying to determine whether something is true or not based on the evidence. My considered opinion is that this is extraordinarily well researched and is an act of actual genuine journalism. And and I find the source to be pretty credible, but I'm not even concerned about the source. The source may be completely uh, unreliable, but I haven't any evidence that the source is unreliable. Let's put it this way: the reason that I find this to be so compelling is because it is extensively researched, it is sourced, it is not making any assertions. Everything that's in it is independently verifiable. And I am absolutely convinced. Let me rephrase that. It's important that I rephrase that. I find the case extraordinarily solid. I'm going to be looking for the counter case. A lot of times, there was a weekend when I thought that Robert de Vere, 16th Earl of Oxford, wrote the works of Shakespeare. I saw a documentary that made a good case for that, and then I thought, well, okay, wow, it must be it. So I went looking for the opposite case. Turns out, not even close. Shakespeare was written by Shakespeare. Only imagine. But this one was it's about an hour long, and it is absolutely compelling. So here's what I would like to do for the rest of the time together here. As soon as you're done with this, I highly recommend that you go look for it, and we'll put a link in the description when we get it up on YouTube. But for the sake of the discussion today, I'm going to just assume that this is in fact true. I'll give you a brief rundown of what the case that's being made is. You can watch it and make the decision on your own. One more time, I'll probably come back to it a couple times, but here it is. The origin, tracking down the origin of the corona Wuhan virus. The case made here, again, using extensive things like screen grabs of emails and so on and so on and so on, is that the Wuhan virus was not accidentally introduced by bats into the seafood market. One of the principal reasons that I find this argument compelling is that he showed evidence that they never sold bats at the seafood market, which you would think would be something that would be the first question you would ask. CP Tomes in our comment section pretty much has it. The short form is, and there is really no super short form, but I'm more interested in the consequences really than making the case. I'll let you watch it, make the case for yourself, obviously. But basically, within about 400 or 500 yards of the seafood market is Wuhan's level 4 virology lab. It is essentially the equivalent of the U.S. Army's infectious disease level 4 facility, and it's very, very close to the Wuhan seafood market. Joshua, through the course of this documentary, shows that, first of all, they didn't sell any bats at the seafood market, and it is a virus that is related to kind of things that we see in bats, coronaviruses in bats. He points out that of the first 14 cases, they did a strong, background and traced the movements of those people, and something like a third of them had never been to the Wuhan seafood market and hadn't been in contact with people who had been, and on and on and on and on and on. What the movie ends up making a case for is that, and an extensive case for, they show a number of emails, including a number of public talks that are available and anywhere on the web. You can just see them. But a Chinese researcher at that lab, a woman, I couldn't pronounce any of their names, and I'm sorry, I just don't remember names, and generally, but in this case, I couldn't pronounce them even if I did. But the woman who was running the research at that lab had been doing experiments for several years. They started it back in they put it in 2003, 2006 after the SARS epidemic. The facility was put in with place with help and financial help from the French. And this researcher, over the last 10 or 15 years, they've shown numerous public talks of hers talking about the coronaviruses that live in the bat community. And what this guy is pointing out is that the structure of the virus that they find in bats is of a structure that makes it not capable of being able to enter human cells, and that what the Wuhan virus shows is that it is a variation of a bat virus which has been genetically modified to include a series of genetic code that basically codes for the spike proteins. Those are the little stems on the outside of every virus image you've seen in the last 30 days. They're basically protein spikes, and these protein spikes are constructed in such a way so that the molecules can come into contact with receptors on human cells that, essentially, simplifying, but that binds the virus to the cell and allows the virus to get inside the cell and then reproduce, explode, and go on. And the short form of a long argument is that there's compelling evidence, virtually overwhelming evidence, that in the course of her studies, this woman was attempting to take bat coronaviruses and splice the S proteins, the spikes, onto them so that they could enter human cells. And that argument, when they were finished making it, was very, very compelling to me. They point out in the documentary that once it became clear that there was something going on, the very first thing that the Chinese government did was that they went down in force to the Wuhan seafood market cleaned it out and utterly just gutted it, which if it turned out that it was just a rumor, it doesn't seem like that's what you'd be wanting to do. You'd want to be collecting evidence. The Chinese government has, without question, this is clearly verified, a number of other different cases, not dependent on it being artificial. They ordered samples destroyed. They ordered cultures of the virus destroyed. And the story that emerges is that this lab, this is the theory, is that this lab was working on bat coronaviruses, that this particular research seemed fascinated, this researcher especially seemed fascinated with the idea of being able to splice coronaviruses from bats alongside the S-spike proteins that would allow it to enter human cells. And that in the beginning of the outbreak, once it was out of the bottle, two or three Chinese researchers at the facility had the courage to basically release to the world the genome of this and call ring all the alarm bells before they were shut down by the Communist Party. And this whole story about the cover-up and everything that follows after that is pretty well documented. But the part that is not documented so well is what happened when it happened in the initial stages of this outbreak. What happened to the Wuhan virus lab? One of the more compelling arguments actually is a very simple one. Logic goes a long way with me. The Wuhan laboratory is China's preeminent virology lab. It's probably the military applications of viruses were being studied there. I'm sure that's not terribly unusual. I'm sure we study them, and I'm sure I know the Russians have studied them, and so on. But the point that's interesting that he makes is that the Wuhan lab has been very, very, very quiet. They've essentially gone completely offline. If it turned out that this virus did come from animal population and broke out at the Wuhan seafood mart, then why would the Wuhan Institute of Virology not be the number one news source in the world? They would have the most advanced information, and the fact that you're not hearing from them at all is kind of spooky. China's already look, when they locked down Wuhan, I know they're trying to rewrite history, but basically, okay, they're claiming it came from the seafood mart. It's not our fault. It just that's where it just happened to leap from the animal population. If that were true, the Wuhan virology lab would be at the scene of the crime and would be issuing reports on a constant basis. But no, people who believe in this theory believe might have been patient zero, the first person infected from this. Her biography is still on the website, but all pictures of her have been taken down. She's basically disappeared. A number of scientists around the world are asking what happened to her. The Chinese government is saying that no, she's fine. I said, well, can we see her? No, that's okay. She's fine. So now, and there are connections to various medical companies and so on. One of the things they point out in the beginning is that we had sent to the Wuhan laboratory, the United States had sent a drug, and I do not remember the name of it. It's an antiviral. But we sent it to them to help because they requested it. And this was before the outbreak, way before. And after we sent it to them, we found out that the pharmaceutical company that is forgive me for this because this is just off of memory, but is run by the grandson of one of the former major party officials in the Communist Party. The Chinese pharmaceutical company put a patent on a drug that the United States sent to them because they requested it for study. So what I think happened is I don't think that this is what I think has happened. I don't think that this was an intentional release of a biological weapon for two reasons. First of all, if you're going to release a biological weapon in the world, I'm not sure it makes sense releasing it in the city where you developed it. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. And secondly, While there is an awful lot about this virus that's suspicious, including its ability to simply kind of hide inside the body, that's alarming. If some of these reinfection data is true, that's extremely alarming. But I do think, yes, the documentary was made by somebody named Joshua Phillip. Uh, but I do think that the case that they make is exceedingly strong that that this got out of the lab, and and that the Chinese government has been doing everything about it they could to cover it up. So now let's get to the point of this particular episode. You can be your own judge about whether or not this is the case. I'm going to continue to look for alternative evidence. I'll give you another quick example of what I was talking about at the beginning when I said, "How do I learn how to weigh evidence?" When people started talking about this, I think the first show I did or the second show I did, somebody said, I've looked at the genome sequence. It is undoubtedly copied. And I mentioned that and people, oh, you shouldn't be spreading conspiracy theories. And I thought, yeah, okay, well, that's right. But but the reason that I was willing to just basically kind of think, now it's probably not intentional, is because you didn't need it. At least I thought you didn't need it until I got more data. In other words, if there is a wet market where wild animals are being brought in, slaughtered, and then sold to people, this is in fact the perfect arena to bring viruses from the animal kingdom into the human population. And so this whole idea of it being manufactured, I kind of dismissed because that's all I know. It's manufactured. I said, well, you don't really need it. You've got a good explanation for why this virus started in Wuhan. And usually the simplest explanation, Occam's razor, as John Galt just pointed out, Occam's razor says that all other things being equal, this is the part that many people don't get. People say money is the root of all evil. No, it's the love of money is the root of all evil. And those are two very different things. A lot of people think that Occam's razor says that the simplest explanation is the true one. That's not what it says. It says all other things being equal, the simplest explanation is likely to be true. So when people say, oh, it's a result of a lab, I thought maybe, but you don't really need it. The wet market is a good explanation for how this got there. And then I got into this and saw a number of virologists saying this is not possible. It is not possible biologically for this virus to have this genetic sequence and this genetic sequence in the length of them. It's not just one or two nucleotides. It's 20, 30,000 of them. It's not possible for this and this to have come together in the way they did randomly because the sequences are internally consistent. So I would like to spend the rest of the time talking about this as if the theory is true, with the understanding that the theory may not be true. But we're going to take the theory as true for the sake of the discussion. From the beginning, I've said that I was willing to write China a pass on the fact that if the thing came from nature, even though I consider the whole wet market thing to be personally and disgusting and morally reprehensible. But there's a difference between having the virus jump from nature and then get out versus having manufactured a virus that is designed to be able to move quickly through human populations. And up until this time, that's all I've been willing to write China a pass for, is that it seemed to me possible and even likely that they did not actually create this virus, that they're not actually responsible in the sense of like being culpable for it appearing in the human population. And everything after that, all of the deceit, all of the stuff we talked about, buying up the personal protective equipment around the world, all of it, the lying, the whole, hey, we've cured it, all of it. Everything since then, they are responsible for. But now, if this theory is true, and I really am beginning to believe it is true, then what appears to have happened is that a Chinese research laboratory doing the most dangerous kind of research possible, namely taking extremely dangerous viruses and and creating versions of them that make it not only easy to infect human tissue, but to make it unbelievably infectious among humans. Essentially, what they're doing is there are elements of I hope you're ready for this good news. HIV sequences are in there. And basically, what they're saying is they take a respiratory coronavirus and they mix it with the genetic structure of the flu so that you get this thing that is as contagious as the flu, but far, far, far more dangerous. As I said, I don't think this particular thing was a bioweapon. You could make the case that maybe they were trying to do research on a number of other things. I know that there's been talk lately about using viruses to go in selectively and kill cancer cells. But we're now in a whole different world if this is true. Because now this isn't a question of nature deciding to come out of hiding. Now we're talking about a virus that has no human immunity at all because it's manufactured and is as contagious as it is because it's manufactured. And whether they meant to let it out of the lab or not, and I don't see any reason or evidence that they did do it on purpose, but it did get out. Now we're talking about an entirely different level of culpability. Now we're talking about something like Bhopal. For those of you who don't remember that name, an American chemical company, I want to say it was DuPont, although I'm not 100% sure that. It's been a long time ago. This was in the 77, I want to say, right around the time I graduated from high school. But there was a chemical factory in India, in a town called Bhopal, and Union Carbide. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to slander anybody there. But basically, there was an explosion, and at this chemical factory, American chemical factory. It was in India, and there was a major problem there, and huge amounts of toxic chemicals were released, and as I recall, thousands of people were killed as a result of this. Now, wasn't that Union Carbide decided that they wanted to kill a few thousand Indians, but Union Carbide was making lethal chemicals in a factory surrounded by people. And when that explosion happened and that chemical release occurred, Union Carbide is legally and morally responsible for this. They are culpable. They are the prime motivator. They're the ones that caused this exposure. The people that died were caused as a direct result of Union Carbide, and Union Carbide's either incompetence or just plain accident, doesn't matter. They put a fatal, lethal facility in the middle of a bunch of people, and they failed to make it safe, and therefore people died, and that is the fault of that chemical company. And so Union Carbide had to pay a large settlement. I'm sure it wasn't as large as it should have been. But they're responsible. They are legally, morally, ethically, financially responsible for that. And now, if this case is true, and I believe it's true, now China is not just guilty of covering it up. China is not just guilty of lying about its transmission and all the rest of it. China is guilty of having created this virus, manufactured it, and let it get out of the out of the lab. The legal term is, as a number of people pointed out, is gross negligence. There's a point where there's an accident, and then there's a point where gross negligence makes you more culpable. By the way, you don't have to prove gross negligence in many cases. If somebody trips and falls in front of your restaurant because you didn't clear the ice away, you can sue that person, presumably. But so here's what I think has happened. I think that that China had been working. This one woman is obsessed with it. This one Chinese researcher obsessed with the ability to get coronaviruses from bats into the human population. And again, this is why this is such a compelling case. There were something like 3 different viruses that were sequenced, and one of them had a long string of nucleotides, and the other one had another long string of nucleotides, and so on. And when they were put together with another pre-existing set of nucleotides, that allowed it to enter the human cells through this S protein arrangement, that's not that's not coincidence. It's not random. It's not possible. It's manufactured. It's got a made in China stamp on it. 15,000 people dead so far in the United States. Oh, 15,000 total dead in 15,000 people killed in the Bhopal incident. Thank you for providing that. So China, if this is true, is legally culpable for this. They're legally responsible for it, and the damages caused around the world are recoverable damages by any definition of law, international law, and all the rest. If Union Carbide had to pay people in India, Indian civilians, because of what that chemical company did overseas, they're responsible. Of course, they should have been responsible. Of course, they should have paid it. And now we're not talking about just 15,000 people killed in a village in India. We're talking about a much larger number of people killed around the world. But the Chinese are not just culpable for the fatalities; they're culpable for the economic damage that has come as a result of the fatalities. And Union Carbide did not deny that they did it. They may have at the beginning, but there was no denying it. And so the damage, the dollar value of the damage done, you can't put a dollar value on the people who've died, although in lawsuits, a value for people who are died, of monetary value, is established pretty much on a daily basis. You know, if somebody has a car, the wheel falls off, and they show it's a defect in the manufacturing, then yes, a dollar value is assigned to every single person that was a victim of that. So what is the world total damage? John Galt says it's tens of trillions of dollars. I think that's going to be an understatement when it's done. I'm not. My primary motivation in this is not to get money out of China, but it's it's going to be my primary motivation when this is over, not to get just the money out of them, but China needs to be held financially responsible for this. And when you look at the amount of damage that they've done to the economy, it is an enormous number. I don't know if it's greater than the total debt that we owe China in terms of money, but I'll bet it's getting there. And and furthermore, I'll tell you something else. The fact that this was handled the way it was handled has caused me to never buy another product that said made in China in it again. If I cannot, if I desperately need something and it says made in China, then I will buy it on eBay so that I don't have to pay for it twice, and so on. And so from the beginning, working back from the present with all the no, it's cured. China's culpability has been almost 100%. Now with this particular documentary making the case that it does, it's fully 100%. They are responsible for the death that this is called around the world, directly responsible. The Chinese Communist Party is directly responsible for it, and all of the economic damage and all of the businesses that have gone out of business, all of it is their responsibility. They gave orders to authorize this research. They gave orders to continue it. They gave orders to cover up the leak. They gave orders to destroy the samples. They gave orders to make sure that no one could get the accurate information of what was going on. They gave orders to begin telling the entire world that America had caused this virus, that the U.S. military had planted it in Wuhan. They gave orders saying that the virus was under control. They continue to give orders every day that are parroted by these idiots in the U.S. media and everybody else that hates the West and themselves, to say that, see, look, China, they just locked everything down, got it completely under control. It's not under control. There's probably, nobody knows how many Chinese are dead as a result of this. But among the many things we talk about in the post COVID, sorry, I made a mistake. In the post Wuhan virus world, one of the things is is going to be the financial fallout. We've been thinking about the financial fallout in terms of the American economy and the world economy and recovering, getting people back to work, and so on. But there is now the world's largest class action lawsuit in place with astonishing amounts of evidence, I think, to indicate that the entire planet is legally, morally, ethically entitled to large trillions of dollars of financial restitution from the actor that created this catastrophe in the first place. So this Wuhan virus is it's even worse. And what's especially alarming about this is that some of the things that we've seen about this virus, its ability to hide, it's not mutating at a very fast rate, but there is some evidence and growing evidence that it is capable of kind of going underground to the same degree that certain viruses like chickenpox, for example. You can get chickenpox, develop immunity to chickenpox, and chickenpox spends most of the time in the rest of your life not out of your body, just hiding in spinal column, I think. But if your immune system gets overstressed enough by stress, this chickenpox virus will return, and it's called shingles. That's basically chickenpox that never actually went away, and and Wuhan is appearing to show some behaviors similar to this. One of the things that this documentary talks about that is especially disturbing, and their evidence case for the virus coming from this Wuhan lab is extremely good. The next phase of this is compelling, but it's not proven. But they point to a number of studies produced by the Chinese military. And one of them talks about, it's a doctrine paper. We have papers that are outlining U.S. military doctrine. Military doctrine exists for every country. A country having military doctrine is not a crime. And a country that's willing to look at the hardest possible case of doctrine is not a crime. The United States has somewhere plans to invade Great Britain, as well as Russia, China, all of it. This is what they do. They have to have these things. There are military plans to invade Canada, Mexico. Just because there's a plan doesn't mean there's going to be action, and sometimes you need to have a plan for pretty much everything. But what this documentary points out in the end is that one of these doctrinal kind of papers that was produced by the high-ranking people in the People's Liberation Army basically said that in the number of encounters that they've had with the U.S. Navy and their attempt to reconquer Taiwan, or at least conquer Taiwan, which has been a ideological, economic, philosophical, and public relations thorn in their side since the Communist Party was declared in 1948, I think, 49. This Chinese military doctrine paper says that in the repeated encounters they've had with the United States Navy, they've realized that the United States Navy is a superior fighting force for them. The fact that the United States of America can project enough power to the point where the Chinese military has no chance whatsoever of getting from mainland China to Taiwan with an invasion force if the United States Navy decides that they don't want them to, is horrifying to them. So this military doctrinal paper talks about something very similar to the idea of asymmetric warfare, which is essentially what terrorism is. And basically, their attitude is that for China to win, China has to have an emotional and moral commitment to do anything. This is the entire point of this doctrinal paper. The paper posits that the only way that China can win these conflicts with the United States is for China to be willing to do anything: terrorism, biological warfare, cyber warfare, whatever. The only chance they have is to play by no rules. That's it. Because if they play anything like by the rules in terms of we got a sub, they got a sub, the United States is just simply going to wipe them out in terms of their ability to invade Taiwan and all the rest of it. So the reason that this is disturbing is that it opens up a number of official policy positions on the part of the Communist Chinese government that basically say, yes, we intend to be the dominant force on the planet. And right now we are still at a disadvantage to the United States in terms of our conventional capabilities and our nuclear capabilities. And so, in order to make up for this imbalance, we have to be prepared to go places where the United States and the West is not prepared to go. We have to be prepared to go with cyber warfare. We have to be prepared to go with deception, espionage. We have to be prepared to go with biological warfare, chemical warfare, cyber warfare, whatever it. Here's what it comes down to: whatever it takes. And this is the position of the Communist Party of China: is that we, as Chinese, have to be prepared to do whatever it takes to become dominant in the world. Now, I have a great number of friends in the military, and I've had the high honor of talking to people at very high levels in the military, advising the military. I've talked to high-level defense contractors and all of them. And I have yet to run into a single American ever who, number one, felt that we had to be the dominant power in the world by any means other than being the product that people most wanted to buy. There has never been, and I suspect never will be, any American objectives to conquer countries by force in order to gain their resources or their land. We have no plans to do this because we have no interest in doing it, and we have no financial, moral, or ethical interest in doing it. I like to think that America is going to be the dominant power for the next century, 2 centuries, or until somebody freer comes along. And I believe that to be the case. But it never entered my mind that America should do whatever is necessary in order to achieve that goal. If you get into that mindset, then you become like Nazi Germany or Communist China or Communist Russia. If America were to dedicate itself to the idea of doing anything necessary, whatever it took, including killing millions of people through biological warfare, in order to maintain our dominance, then that's not America anymore. And I not only would not support that country, I'd oppose it with my life. And so would everybody else that's a real American. So if we are dealing with a country that is decided that they will do anything, then the timing of this virus is, again, I don't believe it was intentionally released, but the timing of it is interesting. Protests in Hong Kong, people were saying that from the beginning. I thought, you don't really need that. But when you look a little deeper into it, what really seems to be a possible explanation, if this was either intentionally released or if the decision to allow it to spread was a conscious one, then you could say that President Trump's sanctions against China have hurt China very badly. We know this is true, but have hurt China to such a degree that Chinese officials are looking at this and saying, this is a game ender for us. And if I had to guess the most likely case, because now we're dealing with speculation, not dealing with evidence, the evidence case against the Wuhan virology lab is overwhelming. I haven't seen the opposing evidence, and when I do, if I do, then I can make a balance in the same way I made a balance between, was the works of Shakespeare written by the Earl of Oxford or was it written by William Shakespeare? Well, if you hear just the Edward de Vere story, wow, he's Shakespeare. When you hear the William Shakespeare story, it's like, pff, not even close. So what I suspect happened, what I'm quite convinced happened, is it came from this Wuhan level 4 virology lab, the equivalent of their biological warfare department. And if I had to guess, based on the way this thing has been treated, the degree of lethality of the disease, the fact that a number of scientists in the early days of this, from the Wuhan virology facility, were broadcasting to the world that this is out and it's dangerous. Here's the genome. Those scientists have disappeared. One of them has died of the virus, and the whole lab is offline. The documentary produces a number of internal emails from the lab saying that it is of absolute national importance that none of this data gets released through social media or any other form, blah, 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 blah. So I think that the most likely case now, based on the evidence that's available in front of me at this time, I think the most likely case is that this lab was doing research into being able to take coronaviruses in the animal population and modify them so that they could be rapidly spread through the human population. The best possible case you can put on this is that they thought that there was perhaps a medical application for this, but I suspect that the most likely case is that they thought this would be a usable bioweapon. I don't believe that this was an intentional release of a bioweapon, because I think if they wanted an intentional release of the bioweapon, they would have made it considerably more lethal, and I suspect they probably could have tailored it genetically to be more. If they'd had more time to work on it, I'm sure they could have tuned it a little bit more in terms of including into the gene sequences that would make it more likely to affect people who were not Chinese, based on the genetic differences that make a Westerner look different than a Chinese nationalist. But I think that they were doing research on this, and I think it got out of the lab. I think the woman who was doing the bulk of this research was obsessed with this idea, and I think that once it was clear it was out, a number of Chinese scientists, and when we get ourselves all lathered up about this, and we rightfully should, let's not forget that there were at least two or three Chinese scientists who risked their lives and very likely gave their lives to get this information out. I don't mean to trivialize it by saying, but it really is kind of like, it's almost like the story of getting the structural flaw of the Death Star out to the rebellion before they were all killed. It's like, this is out there, this is real, here's the genome, this is serious, and then just silence, gone. The whole lab is just off the planet as far as the contact with them is concerned. I don't know enough about international finance. Yeah, many Bothans died to get us this information. Thank you, CP. But let's keep in mind that this is not an issue so much of Chinese people versus American people. It's got to do with ideology. It's got to do with a way of thinking. Chinese scientists, at least one of them, looks like they gave their life to get this information out into the world. That's an act of great courage, especially in a society like that. It's not just an act of great courage, it's an act of humanity. It's an act of fundamental human decency. And we can't forget that. But the people who made the decisions and who continue to make the decisions, those people are culpable and they need to be held accountable. And one of the most disturbing aspects of all this, covered briefly in this documentary, not in length because it's limiting itself largely to facts, but one of the most disturbing aspects of this is watching how American news media have covered this story. Somebody did a tweet just I saw a couple days ago, and it said, hopefully someday you'll find somebody who loves you the way that NBC loves the communist Chinese, and listed a series of articles from NBC News saying, boy, we really, really admire China for the way they've handled this, and just all of it. The news media coverage in this country is driven by hatred of Donald Trump. It's driven by an inability to recover from the fact that the stupid people didn't do what the smart people like journalists told them they should have done. But I am also becoming more convinced every day, and again, I didn't go here because, number one, I'm a naive person, because I'm a trusting person, and number two, I didn't see a need for it yet. I didn't You didn't need to have these people paid off in order for them to be anti-American. This is how I judge evidence. When people say, oh, they're in the pocket of the Chinese government, that could be true. But if it's not necessary, if they hate America and Trump enough so that they would have written it anyway, that's a complication that's not required. This is the essence of how Occam's razor works, as I understand it. This is why I was suspicious of people saying that it was a bioweapon or a manufactured virus, because given the information I had at the time, you didn't need it. It's simpler to say it came out of this wet market. But when the simple statement that the wet market didn't sell bats and everybody agrees that this is a bat virus, that's so obvious that I'm shocked that I didn't think about it myself. So what? So the thing I'd like to just talk about in closing is what do we do about this? Um, I do think that we Americans are so, as a society, are trusting people. We're friendly people. We're open people, and we're naive people. My wife and I have discussed this several times. Uh, my wife is so deeply in love with America and American people. There's hardly a day that goes by when she simply doesn't shake her head. She's been here for 3.5 years. When somebody say, "Okay, you have a good day now," and she's like, "I just can't believe it." And she's good at it, and she's complimentary to people, and she belongs here. She's an American who was born overseas. But she does tell me a lot about how people back in Russia perceive Americans, and a lot of that is a result of Communist Party propaganda and then Putin propaganda that make America responsible for everything. It's convenient for them uh, to make America responsible for their failures. And so I do get to hear not so much how Natasha thinks about the American people, but what her culture often thinks about American people. And this is not unique to Russia. This is widespread around the world. The perception of Americans is that we are children. We're stupid children. We're fat, stupid, lazy children. And we're weak, fat, stupid, lazy children. That's not new. That perception, as I said a couple of shows ago, is universal. And this is why we're constantly underestimated. Because we can, in fact, be weak, fat, lazy, stupid children. We have the luxury to be weak, fat, lazy, stupid children because we have done such an amazing job of defending ourselves and providing prosperity that it's a luxury that we can afford. Like a 40% or 50% tax rate on what we make. We put up with it because we can afford it. But there comes a time when something gets activated in the American psyche. And we walked right up to that line on 9/11. We were plenty angry at 9/11, but we weren't all the way angry. And I think that as this thing starts to, as the immediate threat of it starts to die down and we get this thing under some kind of control, I think we'll find a couple things. First of all, I think that we will find that the Chinese are amazed and will continue to be amazed, not only at our lack of panicking, at least among the American people. That doesn't apply to the news media, who they're paying to panic, but I think they're amazed at how well we're taking this. Every day, well, every week anyway, the fatality expectations for this Wuhan virus are revised downward. That's not an accident. That's not an error of estimation. The initial estimations for the fatality rate of the Wuhan virus were based on what the Wuhan virus was doing in the world. Those The virus didn't change. Our response to it changed. And we find things like, oh, guess what? There's a malaria drug that's been there for 70 years and is very effective against this. And now there's another drug that's showing a great deal of effectiveness against it. Now there's a third drug that's showing 100% effectiveness in not preventing the virus and not providing immunity, but treating it as a therapy. I have some problems, serious problems with AI as unleashed in the same way that the virus is. But AI in its own box, artificial intelligence kept in its own box, is profoundly useful. And one of the things that I read today is that the most powerful supercomputer in the world, IBM computer, I forget the name, it changes every couple years who's got the fastest computer in the world, but the most powerful supercomputer in the world was given this task, and it may not sound like a big deal, but basically when you deal with the virtually infinite number of possible physical constructions that proteins can take, they basically set this artificial intelligence the problem of looking for, here's what the structure of the human cells look like. This is what the virus S proteins look like, the little prongs that attach to the cell. They basically tell this supercomputer, this artificial intelligence, to say, here's what's the key looks like. Here's what the lock looks like. It's way past Deep Blue. It's brand new. Now, since you know that these are how the molecules go together, go out there, this is what they say to the AI, and look at the chemical structure of every single medication that's possible out there and any combination of medications. This is a phenomenally complex issue. Yes, it's not Deep Blue, it's Deeper Blue, it's Azure, that's its name. And so basically, the supercomputer is going through trillions and trillions and trillions of possibilities and has come up with, I think the number was 90, but it may have been smaller than that. Maybe it was 19 or something. I think it was 90. The computer, the artificial intelligence came back with something like 90 existing medications whose chemical structure indicates that they might be effective in treating this virus in terms of its ability to bind to human cells and therefore slow it down or stop it. Now that's fantastic. I don't think the Chinese were prepared for this at all. I don't think they released this on purpose. I think they were working on something to release on purpose. I think they're covering it up as much as they can, but they are legally responsible for it. So what do we do about it? Well, the release of a bioweapon, intentional or not, the fact that if it can be proven that this virus was created in a Chinese lab, that means that China is legally responsible for this. I think it was Summit. Yeah, GK. I think that was the name of it. They're legally responsible. They are legally responsible for the damages that it caused, both in terms of lives lost, in terms of people who are sick, and certainly in terms of the not only of the damage that was caused by as a direct result of the virus. They're also legally responsible, financially responsible for the damage done in order to mitigate the catastrophe that they've unleashed on the world. So, what do we do about this? I don't think we have to go to war with China. I don't think we have to get to a shooting war with China. I think the way that you defeat China is you have them stop making our stuff. I know I'm repeating some stuff I talked about here, but this whole thing is kind of stream of consciousness anyway, and we're getting close to the end of it, so just trying to wrap up some ideas. Up until this virus was released, it made sense, economic sense. You don't have to like it. You don't. In fact, there's an awful lot about it not to like, but it makes economic sense for a company to say that if we have a dollar widget and we can save 4 cents on manufacturing this dollar widget by having these two parts either made in China or assembled in China, then why not? We lower the price, that gives us a competitive edge in the market, and that's how capitalism works. Okay. But none of that makes any economic sense if American people are not willing to buy anything that says made in China. If it turns out that you saved yourself 50 cents on the widget, on the dollar widget, or 90 cents on the dollar widget by having it manufactured in China, that's a compelling argument until you find out that your market will not buy that widget if it's made in China, at which point there is no economic reason to be in China. None. It is a net, it's not a net loss, it's a total loss. It's absolutely zero loss. Now, needless to say that China manufactures so much stuff, and there's hardly any product in the world that you could say is made completely in America or China or whatever the case. So much is manufactured in China that if we were to decide to basically divest ourselves of Chinese products, this would be a long and complicated process. The computer that I'm talking to you on here has any number of parts made in China. I don't know how many of them are, probably most of them. But even if we were able to say, well, we're going to put these chips in here or this RAM in there, it's made in America, whatever the case may be, we may find out that that some of the rare earth elements came from China. You get the idea. We don't have to find ourselves biologically scrubbed clean on this the way we would have to be in a level 4 virology lab, let's say. Once we start deciding that we're not going to buy anything that's made in China, once we see made in China as not only unpatriotic but what it really is, which is an active enemy of the world and the United States. And that's the nice thing about this, by the way. It's not just the United States. It's not just America versus China. It's China versus the world. It's the Chinese Communist Party versus the world. Their attitudes towards the world, their attitudes towards their dominance, their all of it is just simply they don't belong in the family of nations. They don't belong with civilized people. They've shown it again and again and again. So, okay. Once we start deciding as an American people, and this is the only way it's going to work, by the way. The president can't decree this, and even if he did, it wouldn't work. Congress can't decree it, and even if it did, it wouldn't work. And you can count on the mainstream media and the movie business, both of which get enormous amount of their funding from China, to make it crystal clear that any attempt to do this is just nothing but racism and all the rest of it. So the response to China, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be determined by what you as an individual decide you want to do. And if you decide, you don't have to go, like I said, to level 4. You don't have to say, I'm not going to buy any single thing that comes from China. If you simply go into a store and see something that you were going to buy and see made in China and it makes you decide not to buy it, that alone is enough to do it. Somebody had, I don't, I so deeply apologize to people about this because I get so many interesting things sent to me by so many people, and because I get so much, I have a very hard time sourcing it. I just remember it, and a lot of the details about the source go away. But a number of people have pointed out that it's possible to create a not made in China Amazon shopping list that you can basically put together a list that other people can access of products that aren't made in China. So you get the idea. Even American-made products are largely have some element is made in China. That's not what I'm saying. You don't have to go completely this. You just have to stop buying things that are obviously made in China. And this is the most important aspect of this. If you do this, they're finished. They don't create anything. All of their military technology is stolen from the United States. And the laxity that we've had with our defense data is astonishing to me. Astonishing. It's appalling. We needed this. We needed this virus to show us just how blind we've been, in the same way that we needed Pearl Harbor to realize how blind we'd been about the ability to defend ourselves against conventional fleets and armies. We needed 9/11 to show us how poorly prepared we were to defeat terrorism and other forms of asymmetrical warfare, and we have since then put in place measures to make sure that we don't get hit twice by the same thing. I'm wondering if this one is not going to be. I have no doubt that when this is over, this epidemic, this pandemic of 2020, will have hit America hard enough so that we are prepared for a biological incident like this next time far, far better than we are now. And we may be prepared to it to the degree that we're prepared to fight aggressively and preemptively instead of just waiting for the next one. Maybe we're prepared to actually go out there and prevent it the same way we go out and prevent terrorism, and the same way we go out and make sure we know what other people's navies and armies are doing. But I wonder if it's hoping too much to say that maybe this will show us not only how exposed we are to biological threats, but how exposed we are to cyber threats, how exposed we are to EMP threats, how vulnerable the electrical grid is, and so on. I have seen throughout history, especially throughout recent history, the dark side of nationalism. The left continues relentlessly to warn us about the dark side of American patriotism, while conveniently forgetting that the entire left-wing ideology that they support is nothing but a murder pit. And so I am aware that passions can become too inflamed, that innocent people can suffer as a result of this. The internment of the Japanese during World War II, was a pretty shameful affair. With the full understanding, I might add, that some of the people who were interred were in fact Japanese spies, were in fact sympathetic to the Japanese, but that doesn't justify it. Huge numbers of those people were patriotic Americans, the enormous majority of them, in fact, virtually all of them, as far as you're concerned, virtually all of them. Doesn't justify it, but we have to be careful. We have to be careful that when we decide that we are going to get even for this. When I say get even, I mean understand the fact that just as with Iran, we may not be at war with Iran, but Iran is at war with us. And I think when this is all over, we're going to realize what they've realized the whole time, which is namely, we're not at war with China, but China is at war with us and has been for long before the release of this Wuhan virus. And if I wonder if we will do what we think we will. I believe we will. I really do. And I think when it's all over, the country will come out of this much, much stronger. That we will bring a lot of manufacturing back home. The serious savings that we had by sending manufacturing jobs overseas will no longer be worth the savings. That the cost benefit analysis, which by the way is going to determine all of this, folks. You can talk about buying American. You can talk about patriotism. You can talk about Chinese culpability, all of it. But when it's all said and done, the power of the market will do what the market does. And that is that no matter how much you may want to say, oh, well, I try to buy American, people buy Chinese products or products that are manufactured in China by American companies because they're less expensive. And until we make a decision that the people who have had an opportunity to save money by making things in China, until it becomes economically disadvantageous for them to do it, they're not going to change. So by deciding to buy things that are not buying things that say made in China, that will be the economic incentive that will create the political and the manufacturing response and so on. This is an important point. Lasayas AOC says, how many Japanese and Korean Americans are super pissed that this is associated with Orientals? I don't associate this with Orientals. I don't associate this with Asian people. I don't blame this on Asians, and I don't blame it on people who are Chinese. I blame it on communists. I blame it on totalitarian oligarchs. When it's all said and done, the Wuhan virus will have killed far more Chinese than anybody else in the world. And I think China is long past due to overthrow this archaic, brutal, last surviving example of socialism at its purest form. But I've never, not for an instant, have I felt that, forget Japanese or Koreans or Chinese, they're our allies, and they've been Japanese and Koreans have been doing an amazing job. Taiwan's been doing an amazing job. Taiwan needs to be recognized, and and that's that. We made that decision years and years ago. Years ago, I want to say back in the 70s, maybe right after Nixon's visit, we decided, okay, it either has to be Taiwan or China, and we decided to recognize China because they were a growing power, and kind of leave Taiwan out in the cold. And I think that was a poor decision, and I think we knew it at the time. I think we knew that that was a devil's bargain, that we were recognizing people who we understood to be evil because they were powerful and rich, and we wanted to do business with them. But always clear to me that the abandonment of Taiwan was not the it may have been the smart thing to do, but it wasn't the right thing to do. But I think China is finished as a result of this. I think they're finished. I think the Chinese Communist Party is finished. I don't have any opinion about internal uprisings or anything else. But when this damage is done and the devastation is clear and the economic impact is done, we'll discover that this entire thing that looked like an act of nature was not. It was an act of politics. Whether they intentionally released it or not, the fact that they were performing research in this area indicates to me that they were certainly looking at biological weapons implications. And far from being the model of efficiency that has managed to shut down the coronavirus, it's just another case of communist incompetence and communist disregard for human life, their own or others, in order to save face for a system that only survives because it is able to enforce the saving of face. The reason that the Soviets didn't allow American magazines, American radio, American music into the Soviet Union was because the only way that the Soviet Union could survive was if they were able to deprive enough of their people of an accurate view of what they were missing. And this is exactly what China's doing. They're trying to do it in the information age. These people actually think they can get away with this. That's the part I find actually the most delusional about the Chinese leadership, is they actually think they can get away with it. In this day and age, they think that they can cover these things up. In the age of the internet, they think that they can scrub evidence that's been released to the internet. And Josh's documentary is crystal clear evidence that that's not the case. It's there. It's captured. We have the primary documents, and the regime is ultimately so inhuman and childish that the propaganda that seems to work on their people only works on the people of China or North Korea because that's all they see. But when I saw that busload of the doctors coming back and everybody waving the little red flags and hugging everybody and coming down the stairs of the airplane with the male doctors in blue and the female doctors in pink holding little banners and waving their flags, I said, who buys this? Who's childish enough to buy this? Does anybody, who could, do the Chinese people believe this? Just as a very, very quick departure, I thought that's not possible. They can't possibly believe it. Then I saw something with my own eyes that made me think, no, perhaps they do. There was a documentary 10 years ago now. It was about a group of Western eye surgeons who had been given permission to go to North Korea and treat a number of North Koreans for relatively simple but serious eye conditions. People who had become blind because of something that a simple chemical treatment or a simple operation could cure. And and when these people were when they regained their sight, when they were given the miraculous gift of sight by Western science, the first thing that they did spontaneously when presented with a picture, this is before Kim Jong-un, so Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung on the walls of every building, once they could see again and they saw the pictures of dear leader, they fell to their knees and wept and thanked them for it. And I perceived that they were telling the truth. I perceived that that wasn't a show. I've seen the video of North Koreans wailing at the death of Kim Jong-il, and that's acting. But what I saw with these people when they were suddenly given vision and told that it was a result of their overlords, I thought, no, they really do believe this. They do. They have nothing to compare it to. They are the living definition of an unsophisticated audience. This is all they've ever seen. They buy this communist propaganda, and I'm sure most Chinese just accept that that's true, that when they see these people coming off of buses, oh, we defeated it, of course we did. Um, so, um, the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, it's not a mistake on their part. I don't think they did it intentionally, but it is an inevitable byproduct of their political system. In the same way that the gulags and the secret police and the Cheka and all of that is an inevitable byproduct of the Soviet communist system, is why this happened. And this catastrophe that has come around the world, continues to do unbelievable amounts of damage, is not an accident of the Chinese Communist Party. It's the direct result of the Chinese Communist Party philosophy. Whether they did it intentionally or not, the fact is they were working on it. They were working on it for the reasons that we suspect they were working on it for, and if it got out before they wanted it to, it doesn't matter. This is what they do. This is who they are. And I think it's time for the world to realize that we don't want these people making our stuff. And we got to get a lot more serious about these people stealing our stuff. We got to get a lot more serious about having their students working in American labs gaining the the absolutely priceless experience of working with free people, learning the techniques that free people are able to invent because of their freedom of imagination and action, and then taking these results back to the Communist Party of China to have them weaponized. This needs to happen, and I hope to be constantly reminding people that this needs to happen. But I will warn you in advance, folks. One of the things that I will be doing as this thing settles out too is I am going to be constantly reminding all of us that our anger should be focused on the people who are responsible for our anger, and that there are enormous numbers, millions and millions and millions of Americans that are either of Chinese descent or naturalized citizens, or people who've been in America for 3, 4, 5 generations of Chinese descent. These people are as American as you or I are, you or I am, and I'm not gonna. I am going to be on my guard against having the appropriate righteous anger that we feel overflow its boundaries and begin to damage people who who don't deserve it. People who are on our side, on the side of freedom, on the side of all of that stuff. Americans come from all over the world, including China. And when we saw that footage of that Chinese woman buying up all those masks, I think everybody realized, yeah, she lives here, but she's not an American. And her husband, who was born in America, is not an American either. So we have to be careful. And the reason we have to be careful is because if we don't, if we're not on our guard about letting this anger out of its boundaries, if we let it own us rather than become a justifiable weapon for our defense and our sense of justice, if we let this weapon of our righteous anger take control of us, then we lose. Because if America becomes Nazi Germany or communist China in an attempt to fight them, then there's no reason to even get out of bed anymore. I might add that I have no doubt that we will do this as well as we did it after 9/11. People are constantly talking about Islamophobia. We watched Islamic nationals in service of their religion fly airliners filled with American citizens into building. We watched iconic structures of our greatest city collapse into the bodies of 700 American firefighters. We saw this. We saw them celebrating in the streets. We know what the last words spoken on the flight deck of every one of those 4 airliners that went into the ground on 9/11. We know for an absolute fact what the last 2 words heard on all of those flight data recorders were. The 2 Arabic words that were spoken, we know what they were on every one of those cases. And we didn't pull Muslims out of their houses and beat them to death, and we didn't do any of this stuff. We behaved, with a few exceptions, which still were, to me, remarkably restrained. We behaved like adults, and I expect that's what we'll do again. And I'm not worried that we'll get out of those bounds, but if we do, somebody has to remind us that innocent people are innocent people and guilty people are guilty people. And our entire idea, our entire theory of humanity is that we're willing to let guilty people go before seeing innocent people punished. Anyway, I would strongly advise all of you, if you do it now, I know it's running late, it's midnight back in the East Coast, late start today, but I would advise all of you to go to YouTube, search for this, tracking down the origin of the Wuhan coronavirus. As documentaries go, I think it is extraordinarily well researched. If somebody out there is able to point to me reasons why it's false, or evidence that the people who produced it have a history of misrepresentation or anything like that, then I will certainly look at that evidence, and if it's compelling, then I'll change my mind again. Um, but I am 100% convinced, absolutely, utterly convinced. At my entire adult life, I have never feared these people. My wife sometimes thinks that's naive of me, but I think as time goes on and she sees what we're capable of and what they're capable of, I think she becomes more convinced that it wasn't just plain knee-jerk patriotism when I say I don't fear these Chinese. I don't care how modern their society is. I don't care how new it is. I don't care about their skyscrapers. I don't care. I don't fear them. They don't scare me. They are not competitors of ours, and they never will be. They have intelligence, but they don't have imagination, and the entire structure of politics that they built not only lacks imagination, it lacks humanity. And I do not fear people who are as smart as we are, but not as bright in terms of imagination, not as friendly, not as open, and not as human. I don't fear them in the slightest. I never have, and I fear them less now than I ever have in my entire grown life. They developed these viruses because they know that despite a million and 1.4 billion robots that they can order into their factories, they know that they can't invent these things. They know that they'll never come up with an iPhone. They'll never come up with a Google. They'll never come up with any of this stuff. They can build 4 or 5 destroyers for every one of ours, but their weapons won't work. Their crews won't work. When you get into the stress of combat, they will not perform the way that we perform because we learned our lessons the hard way and we learned them and we applied them. They cannot apply the lessons that we learned because they cannot conceive of trusting their own people. So um, I am not the slightest bit concerned. If there is anything to this idea of racial intelligence IQs in terms of uh, sort of a baseline, all evidence in this particular area says that Asians are considerably smarter than Europeans if that evidence is sound, and I'm not saying it is. But even that never worried me. People say, well, the average Asian person may have, if the studies are true. Some studies are true. Maybe they have 7, 10%, 10 IQ points on the average European or the average American. I don't care. It's not just about that. It's not. It's the culture. It's the freedom. And I get so pleased that I actually turn into smug. I start, there are times like now when I want to just wallow in my own crapulence at how lucky I am to be part of this society, how proud I am of it, how miraculous I think it is, and no matter how badly we allow ourselves to screw ourselves up, there is something fundamental in the structure of this place and this place alone that owns the future and always will. I am unspeakably proud of it. And I think that when this is done, we will look back on this as a blessing that we paid a high price for, in the same way that I was blessed by having a landing that I consider to be a crash landing as a student. When I had my 3 or 4 hours of solo time, I was trying to do a spot landing. I got into a pilot-induced oscillation, told the story 100 times. I thought I had crashed the airplane. I was certainly no longer in control of the airplane. I was utterly convinced that I'd crashed the airplane, and I couldn't get out of the cockpit because my knees wouldn't work. And when I called my flight instructor, I told him I just crashed this airplane. He said to me, "Is the airplane permanently damaged?" I said, "There doesn't seem to be indication of it." He said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Then you didn't crash the airplane." And then he said the thing I never forgot, which is, "You just got very, 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 very lucky, Bill. You had the living hell scared out of you, and it didn't cost you anything." And I'm not saying that this virus hasn't cost us anything, but if we come out of this awake, then the price that we've paid for this will be worth it. And the America that we're going to see coming out of this is going to astonish the world. And I'm glad I'm going to be there to see it. That'll do it for this edition of the CoronaSphere Lounge, made possible by those American, I want to say they're patriotic Americans. There are many patriotic Americans that aren't members of this site, but they do understand that the message of American patriotism is not just a knee-jerk kind of "I was born here." There is a logic, a reason. There's an ethic, a moral case, a philosophical case. There is a case for America. There is an argument for America. And it's my enormous honor and tremendous privilege to be able to make that case. And if you want to help us do that, then we would love to have you here. Our friend Dave Big Booty, otherwise known as Dave Olson, says just pointed out he's been a member since 2012. I want to once again single him out, not just for you, Dave, but because of who you are and what you do. Dave is a truck driver. A lot of times Dave gets to watch the show or gets to watch the first part of the show and then listens to the rest of the Stratosphere Lounge in his truck. And I want to tell you, Dave, but mostly I want to tell you so that you can tell all of your other colleagues that you are the heroes of this fight. And of all of the things that I'm happiest about in terms of the things that we've all been unhappy about, nothing makes me happier. Nothing makes me happier than watching news media personalities, and especially these celebrities, talking to us from home and telling us that everything's going to be okay and don't worry, it's fine, just hunker down in your $10 million mansion. I have never been so proud of common people in this country ever, and I've always been proud of them. Truck drivers are keeping this country alive. You are out there day and night, and when I first saw the shelves in the store empty, I was so upset. I went out in my car and I cried. I'd never seen it before. It just knocked the guts out of me, and I felt miserable for 2 whole days. And the instant I stopped feeling miserable about this and just sick to my stomach that this kind of thing like panic buying and empty shelves in American stores, the instant that went away was less than 48 hours later when I went to a grocery store and saw that everything had been restocked. It looked like a busy day. Yes, there were canned foods section was pretty empty, but the rest of the store was overflowing. And I turned to my wife and I said, "This is the American engine at work. You cannot kill this thing. You can't." And it's because of guys like you, Dave, not because of guys like me or anybody else. It's guys like you who are out there on the road, in the middle of the night, driving through rain and snow and all the rest of it. And I would like you, if you're able to pass on to all of your truck driver friends and all of the people that unload your trucks and load them on the other end, how much we appreciate what you're doing, and how happy I am that as a society we had to go through a shock like this so we could understand who the real heroes are and who the real Americans are. And I'm just real proud to know you, and I'm very grateful for your membership. That'll do it for this edition of the CoronaSphere Lounge. We'll see you here tomorrow right here on BillWhittle.com.